Hey there, and welcome to DIY Projects with Pete. In today's episode, we'll be working on this kitchen island counter with a waterfall edge. It's made out of a concrete overlay product to save on weight. And if you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started with today's project. I want to give a big shout out to Maytag for sponsoring today's video. The fridge, stove, hood, and microwave all work great and look really sharp in the kitchen, so definitely check them out if you're in the market for some new appliances. The first step was to remove the doors and drawers and to protect the base cabinets by taping them off. If you're interested in seeing a basic overview of how the kitchen island base cabinets were built, you can check out the video and post at DIYpete.com/kitchen island. For today's project, we're going to build up the shape and thickness of the counters using plywood. I've built quite a few concrete counters and tables over the years, casting solid concrete counters, but I calculated the finished project using that technique with the side panels to be about 1,200 pounds, which would be quite a bit of stress on the second floor of the home and against the hickory floors. So I wanted to show another option for a concrete top, which is DIY friendly. We'll basically be using an exterior grade polymer concrete overlay that's tough, made to last, and pretty easy to work with. To get a thickness of a little more than 2¼ inches, we'll be using 3 sheets of plywood. Now the side panels are going to have an angle to them to give this counter kind of a unique look. I actually started out with square panels, but then I thought it looked a little blocky for this space. So I created a template and then cut out 5 more side panels. Once the panels were complete, I glued them together to build up the thickness. Then I used quite a few screws from the inner side to secure them. Next, I trimmed and then sanded the boards to even up the edges since they didn't match perfect. The side panels were then secured to the island using wood screws. Now, I attached them from the outside, which was a bit of a mistake, and I'd recommend attaching them from the inside of the base cabinets. This way, you'll be able to remove the counter and side panels if you ever choose to have a different type of counter. And, it's going to be a bit harder for me to remove it, unfortunately, but I do plan on having it a long time, so it's not that huge of a deal. Next, I started building up the top's thickness. The counter is about 7 feet wide by 53 inches, and so I had to use a few sheets of plywood and have a seam. I staggered the seams for each layer, and then fastened the ends into the side panels, and then wood glue and shorter screws were used to connect each layer. Once everything was in, I trimmed up the edges a bit using a circular saw, and then attached the base cabinets to the plywood from the underside with some wood screws. I added a couple outlets with USB ports to each side panel, so there's power for appliances or if anyone needs to charge a phone or plug in a computer. The next step was to add a bonding agent for the concrete overlay. I ordered everything from a company that specializes in concrete overlay products, and then I rolled 1 coat of the pink bonding agent onto the plywood and used mesh tape at each of the seams. If your counter is less than 48 inches in depth, then you won't need to have a seam on the top like I did. The overlay product consisted of 2 different types of micro toppings. The first is the rough grade material, which is basically a scratch coat that's going to give the more fine micro topping a good base and something to bite to. It has a more coarse and sandy texture when it goes down. Mix the material to the manufacturer's specifications, and then use a trowel to spread 1 coat of the material over all of the surfaces. I started by pouring the material on the top and then covering that entire area first. I let the excess run down the sides, which helps for getting the material onto the side panels easier. This is a pretty messy process, so make sure the floors are protected. The sides and edges are also a bit tricky, but a paintbrush works pretty well for getting material into corners and on the edges. You'll want to get this layer on as smooth as possible with the trowel so you have fewer bumps and lines to sand once it dries. I let the rough coat dry overnight before applying the final mixture. The next morning I came back and used a coarse block and then a mason's rub brick to sand the rough areas. Make sure you hit all the surfaces and knock down all the high spots. And once this is complete, you can use a shop vac to clean up the area. I mixed a little charcoal coloring into the fine micro topping to darken the color a bit. Mix the overlay according to the instructions with the product. The manufacturer recommended about 5 to 6 thin coats of the micro topping, so we'll be mixing up a few batches. The coats all go on pretty thin, and the first layer is going to bond to the scratch coat, and it's going to fill in and give the counter a smooth look and feel. The material will go a long ways. I started by pouring the overlay on the top and then spreading it around with a trowel. You'll be able to use nice tight pulls to spread the material and to apply it evenly. Any excess can run down the sides and edges. Having excess flow over the sides actually makes it easier to get the overlay on the vertical surfaces. Use the trowels similar to how you did on the top. The overlay should go all the way down to the floor covering, and then a gray silicone can be used later as a finishing touch for the floor transition. Go over the overlay a time or two to smooth it out and to minimize any chatter marks. Apply the overlay with a trowel to the underside of the counter. This is a bit tricky, but worth spending the extra time to give it a nice smooth feel. Then use a brush to get in the hard to reach areas, and then a putty knife with a metal blade works well to smooth out the harder to reach areas that a trowel is too big for. Let the coat dry completely and then do a light sanding to get it smooth. Have a vacuum around to help minimize dust, and wipe down the surface with a little water prior to applying the second coat. The rest of the coats will go on easier and a little thinner. You'll basically repeat the process we did for the first coat, but there's going to be less sanding between coats as it's going to be easier to get a smoother finish with the trowel. Use your hands to help create a beveled edge. After all the layers, I was able to have nice beveled edges, but if you'd like really rounded edges, you could round over the plywood edges even more before applying the overlay. The smooth micro topping is basically cement mixed with polymers, so it spreads like butter and is easy to get smooth. With the overlay technique, you will see the trowel marks in the finished piece, which I like, and I think it kind of gives it a cool organic look, but you can sand or polish them out quite well if you prefer less of a troweled look. I like to have a spray bottle with water to lightly hit any areas that I need a little more working time to get smooth. Continue building up the overlay until you've completed about 6 coats or whatever the manufacturer recommends. Here's a look at the final layer, and I'm sanding it prior to applying the sealer. I cleaned up the work area and then applied a water-based, food-safe concrete counter sealer to all surfaces of the concrete. I did about 5 to 6 coats of sealer to protect it well and to give it a nice shine. I like to dilute the first couple coats of sealer with water at about a 1-to-1 ratio to help it go on even, and then the last few coats go on at full strength. You can also wax the countertops for some additional stain protection. Lastly, I wired the outlets, put the doors and drawers back on, did a couple finishing touches, and called it good. All right, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's video and that it inspires you to build something for your kitchen. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for watching, and cheers from Montana.
Happy birthday!